Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Double. Yeah. Some will work.
So, yeah, it's an honor to meet you, by the way, too. And
I'm glad you guys could
big
come over.
influence on everybody. I hope you know that you've made a huge difference in the lives of so many people. I mean, you're so humble about it. You seem so humble about it, but you really have.
Nothing special. It really isn't. Yeah.
Well, okay, so what are your thoughts on the past week's events leading up to the invasion of Iraq, and how's the media portrayed this?
Well, the media are mostly a cheering section, but that's normal. You know, when a country goes to war, the media become worshipful of power. So, not too surprising.
Right.
But, I mean, it's not nice, but not surprising. And the build-up, I think, you know, there has been, in fact, a very spectacular government media propaganda campaign in the last several months, and its effects are quite remarkable. So, you take a close look at polls, you'll notice that in the United States, support for the war is considerably higher than anywhere else in the world. But that's only part of the story. If you look at people's reasons for supporting the war, you find that the United States is just off the spectrum. In the United States, by now, about 60% of the population, roughly, regard Iraq as an imminent threat to the United States. And nobody else in the world thinks that.
Not even in the region.
Not even Kuwait or Iran. They hate Saddam Hussein, but they don't think it's a threat.
Yeah.
This is the weakest country in the region. Can't do anything. But in the United States, people are genuinely afraid. Almost half the population now thinks that Iraq was responsible for September 11th.
Right.
That's
right.
just outlandish. You know, if you go back a couple of months, that wasn't true. It starts in September. September is when the government media propaganda campaign began to convince people that Saddam Hussein is an imminent threat, and that he was somehow involved in 9/11. Now, they all know it's not true, and they don't actually say it. It's just insinuated all the time, and it has changed people's attitudes remarkably. So if you go back, say, after September 11th, the number of people who thought Iraq was involved is about 3%.
Right.
By now, almost half think there were Iraqis on board and they organized it. That's tremendous achievement of propaganda.
Right.
And now, if you went to the media, they say, well, we didn't say that, which is true. They didn't. They just repeated with complete conformism the insinuations by the government that this is true, knowing exactly what they're doing.
Right.
And occasionally there'd be some statement saying, well, there's much evidence for it or something like
Right.
that. But the effect of the drumbeat has been astonishing. And furthermore, these attitudes are very highly correlated with support for the war, as you'd expect.
Right.
And if you take this fear factor away, opposition in the United States is approximately like everywhere else. Furthermore, what is not being pointed out is that all of this is second nature to the people now running Washington. I mean, these are the same people who ran the country in the 1980s. You know, if you're even minimally sane, you want to figure out what they're doing, you look at what they did the first time in power.
Right.
About, 1989 to 1992, they were running the country. It's almost the same people. Well, what did they do? They were pushing the panic button every year. Nicaragua was 2 days marching time from Texas, about to conquer us, following a script from Mein Kampf.
Right.
The Reagan administration actually declared a national emergency. If somebody from Mars were watching this, they wouldn't know whether to laugh or cry. A year before that, the Russians were going to bomb us from an air base in Grenada.
Right.
Before that, there were Libyan hitmen in the streets going to assassinate our leader.
Right.
Then another year it was drugs, which is going to destroy the country, and certain drugs. And another year was crime, and one thing after another, all fabricated. Say crime and drugs are no different in the United States from other industrial countries, but fear is much greater,
Right.
and it's engendered. And you can check it. You can see how the government media campaigns immediately reflect themselves in people's concerns and polls. Drugs is and that's the way you keep people in line. Well, why do you have to keep them in line? Because most of the population is strongly opposed to the domestic policies and the international policies. So throughout the whole Reagan years, the policies were harming the population, and they didn't like it. Contrary to a lot of propaganda, Reagan was not popular. He ended up being the most unpopular living president, apart from Nixon, ex-president. And right through, he was kind of on the order of Carter popularity. But there was and for very simple reasons, people didn't like his policies. The international policies were massive terror.
Right.
I mean, in Central America, Southern Africa, the Middle East, and so on, these guys now in Washington were responsible for the worst terrorist atrocities of the period, and they were severe. I mean, just take Southern Africa. When Colin Powell was supposed to be the moderate, when he was National Security Advisor, they continued to support South Africa, while South Africa evading congressional sanctions so as to increase support. In 1988, when he was National Security Advisor, South Africa, the ANC, Mandela's ANC, was condemned as one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. South Africa at the time was devastating the surrounding countries. They killed about 1.5 million people just in the Reagan years in Angola and Mozambique alone. U.S. supporting them all the way, Britain too. I mean, do you see anything about this?
Oh, yeah.
In the papers?
No, you don't see. I mean, I see what you're saying.
But, and this is the most obvious things to look at if you want to find out what they're up to.
Yeah.
Furthermore, because they do the same things right now.
Right.
But this has got to be eliminated.
Right.
Not just the media, but commentary, intellectuals. You have to go to specialized historians, or else the dissident literature to find out what was going on.
How do you see Colin Powell's role in this? Like, many people are saying the only reason why they support the war is because of the integrity of Colin Powell.
He's a dove. They say he's a dove.
Taken them on board.
But don't forget, this is more than usual. It's common always, but more than usual, this is a PR administration. Every individual in it is carefully crafted. So George Bush is created to be the simple, honest guy in a cowboy suit, not a spoiled frat kid from Yale who probably doesn't know where the world is. But he's simple, honest, full of integrity, gut feelings. I mean, no article about him can fail to use the word vision and dream over and over again. Take a look at this morning's Wall Street Journal. The lead story is about his dream for the Middle East and his vision of this and that. Yeah, all of that is very carefully done. And Colin Powell is crafted to be the man of integrity and the multilateralist and, pursuing diplomacy and so on. So therefore, when he comes out and says, well, we got to go to war, that really proves it. Do you know anything in his record to support that image?
About the integrity
and the moderate and the multilateral. I can't find anything.
Right.
But it's I have no idea who he is or what he is, but there's nothing in the record to support it. It's kind of like good cop, bad cop sort of thing. And then when the good cop says, well, got to throw you into the electric chair, how could you?
That's an excellent
But it's mostly public relations. Furthermore, most of the population knows it. So you go back to the 2000 election, Bush election. Just take a look at the reaction to that. I mean, all the business about the Florida shenanigans in the Supreme Court. Huge issue among intellectuals.
Right.
The public didn't care. And one of the things that was noticed in all this furor about it is that the public just didn't seem to care if it was a stolen election. So what? If you want to know why, take a look at these studies of public opinion. They're very carefully studied. At Harvard is a study of voters. They monitored people's attitudes right in the pre-election period. And it turns out right before the election, about 75% of the public didn't take it seriously. They thought it was a farce. They said the candidates are just creations of the public relations industry. You can't believe a word they say. They don't understand the word they're saying.
The shadow.
Yeah, it's just to try to make them this kind of guy you'd like to be with in a bar or something like that. They couldn't understand their position on the issues, and that was purposeful. You're not supposed to understand their position on issues. And most people thought it's just a joke. So if it was stolen, who cares? It's mostly among intellectuals that these things are taken seriously. They have their own reasons. But Powell and Vision does is, but not if you're worshipful, and you got to be worshipful. Another thing that really is not discussed, although it's so obvious, it's hard to miss, is the brazen contempt and hatred for democracy that is being demonstrated. By the intellectuals in the United States. Just take a look at the new and old Europe business. What's the difference between old and new Europe? I mean, old Europe are the countries where the governments are taking the same position as the vast majority of the population. New Europe are the countries like Italy and Spain where the leaders are following orders from Crawford, and 90% of the population opposes it. Turkey is condemned because the government's taking the position of 95% of the population. That proves the government doesn't have democratic credentials. And in fact, if you look at the so-called pundits, they're trying to figure out what it might be that leads France and Germany to be so disruptive, and to cause diplomacy to fail. What does that mean? That means not to follow U.S. orders and to do what your own population says you ought to do. Now, you can certainly look into the motives of the governments, and they can be whatever they are. But what isn't even conceivable is that they're following the position of their own population. I mean, that expresses, contempt for democracy at a level which is pretty hard to find an analog. But at the same time, the next article over talks about George Bush's dreams and visions of democracy. Well, this is effective propaganda. So it's somehow their fault if they're following popular, the large majority, overwhelming majority of the population. There were international Gallup polls in January, which were not published in the United States, to my knowledge, barely mentioned here. But they were quite interesting. What they showed, they didn't cover every country, but they covered quite a lot. Support for the kind of war that Bush is fighting, what's called a coalition by the propaganda system, meaning me and Tony Blair. That war, support for that didn't even reach 10% almost anywhere. Well, that's kind of war. And it was strong. The opposition was strongest in New Europe. That's why protests in Italy and Spain are way beyond other countries. Another aspect of this contempt for democracy is the concept of anti-Americanism that's used. Actually, a professor at UMass a couple of years ago, Paul Hollander, published a book called the Anti-Americans or something. That was one of them. The anti-Americans are people who criticize the foreign policy of the United States. They're anti-Americans. Well, that's the way it's used now today. I mean, listening to the radio this morning, NPR, they had a serious discussion about when dissent becomes anti-American. Well, yesterday in Italy, they practically closed the country down in general strike. Does anybody call that anti-Italian?
Right.
I mean,
Americanism.
It's inconceivable. You're not anti-Italian if you oppose the policy of the government. You're anti-American if you oppose the policy of the government only on one assumption, totalitarianism. If you identify the leadership with the country and the society and its culture, then to be critical of the leadership is to be anti-American. And that's almost universal with regard to the United States. It's particularly interesting in Paul Hollander's case because he's a Soviet specialist, and he knows perfectly well that almost the only other country where this existed was the Soviet Union. If a dissident was critical of the government, they were denounced as anti-Russian or anti-Soviet. And that's a strictly totalitarian concept. But it's accepted here as normal. So we can discuss whether protest is anti-American, but you don't talk about protest in Spain as being anti-Spanish.
Exactly.
It's comical. And in fact, if you have any conception of democracy, the whole concept is comical. I mean, that tells you a lot about Anglo-American intellectual culture. And that ought to be discussed. And you can go on and on.
It's somewhat ironic. That's one of the reasons why we're going into Iraq, so that because people can't dissent. They have to follow along. That's a reason for going. Pseudo reason for going in there.
And, just to point these things out would be elementary, integrity on the part of journalism and commentary, but it's inconceivable.
What about the veto power of the United States too? Something else that's not.
Just ask yourself a very simple question.
Right.
Suppose Iraq had the veto.
Right.
How many resolutions
None.
would they be? None. All right, so if you're even serious about talking about violating Security Council resolutions, you look at the veto.
Exactly.
Well, who's way in the lead in vetoes?
United States.
Far in the lead. Second is Britain, and nobody else is even shouting distance. And furthermore, the timing is interesting. That's since the mid-'60s. Before the mid-'60s, there were no U.S. vetoes. Why? Well, before the mid-'60s, the UN was completely under the control of the United States. This is the post-war period,
Right.
And as decolonization took place, and the UN became more representative of other countries,
Right.
including the colonial countries, and as the other industrial countries recovered, the UN just became less an instrument of U.S. power.
Mm-hmm.
So then the U.S. started vetoing everything.
Right.
Again, if you're even minimally serious about Iraqi violations, this is right in the front.
Right.
In fact, if you want to go and be a little bit more serious, you notice that U.S. client states are in violation of many more. Israel, Turkey, and Morocco are all in violation of more Security Council resolutions than Iraq, and much more serious ones. I mean, Iraq's, the resolutions are, well, they haven't completely disarmed.
Right.
Okay, maybe they have, maybe
Right.
they haven't, but whatever that is, that's not at the level of military occupation, aggression, the grave violations of the Geneva Conventions, in occupied territories. Those are serious. And the only reason that there aren't more such resolutions is because the U.S. vetoes them.
Yeah.
So we're back to the veto again. None of this is discussed.
Yeah, it's funny though, when I said that to my American foreign policy professor, he incidentally used to work for the State Department, and he said he couldn't understand what I was saying.
No, they can't understand.
He said, well, they wouldn't be in violation because they vetoed it. And I said, well, I don't get your point. He actually said that.
No.
And I said, well, the obvious question, fundamental truth, is that fair?
Yeah, I'm just asking him. Suppose Iraq had the veto.
Right.
I mean, it's so elementary, but you're right. People cannot understand
Is
it.
there something about serving power that...
The service to power is so deeply rooted that it's unconscious.
Right.
And people can't understand when... I mean, you could explain this... I can explain this to my 10-year-old grandson. He doesn't have any problem with it.
Right.
But if you're well-educated, you simply can't understand
How
it.
much of that really is unconscious? Do you believe?
I think it's unconscious.
Really?
I mean, it's just impossible for people to understand.
Yeah.
Or take another issue. I mean, one of the main purposes of this war, I think, is to establish what international lawyers and others, your future friends, call new norms of international behavior. So if you look even at the liberal critics of the war, they say, well, there's the UN Charter, which established certain norms like self-defense and so on, but now there's new norms emerging. The new norms are the norms of humanitarian intervention, and they're becoming new. If you read the legal literature, it's full of this. These are new norms that the revolution consider that. How did these new norms get established? Because the U.S. said so.
Right.
I mean, if you look at there have been interventions in the post-war period which stopped massive atrocities, namely in the 1970s. Those are by far the most important cases. India invaded East Pakistan, Bangladesh, put an end to terrible atrocities. Millions of people were getting killed. 1971. In 1979, Vietnam invaded Cambodia. They terminated Pol Pot's atrocities exactly when they were peaking. All these piles of skulls and so on are from the time when, just before Vietnam invaded. So why wasn't the 1970s? There's nothing in the 1990s that begins to compare with that. So how come the 1990s, 70s didn't establish new norms? Well, the wrong people.
Right.
It's not us. It's those guys out there. Furthermore, another reason is the U.S. was strongly opposed to both of these invasions and punished India and Vietnam severely for having put an end to massive atrocities. So the 1970s can't be the place for new norms. There's another point. Does the world have anything to say about these new norms? Well, there is an organization, the Non-Aligned Governments, G77, they're sometimes called, it's now about 132, which constitutes, the government's about 80% of the world's population. Well, they have voices. They don't grunt. In fact, they have summit meetings at which they publish long, detailed declarations elaborations of analyses of the world situation, the international economic situation, other things. Nobody ever talks about it. They get maybe a disparaging word here or there. But they've talked about humanitarian intervention. They just had another one in February. I don't think it was even reported. They had one in 2000, barely reported. In both of them, they discussed what they called the so-called right of humanitarian intervention. And they condemned it. This is just old-fashioned imperialism. We know all about this. And when you were invading India, the Philippines, or anything else, it was humanitarian intervention. We don't accept the so-called right of humanitarian intervention. We know we have plenty of experience with it. Thank you. Does that have anything to do with the norms? No. I mean, that's the wrong people again. What all of this demonstrates is, I think, something else that is completely unconscious, and that is the deep-seated racism of Western intellectual culture. You cannot conceive that those people out there should have anything to say, or that India and Vietnam might establish a norm. That's inconceivable. All the way over to the left, incidentally. It's just inconceivable. Norms are established by us. And if the world sees it as just more traditional imperialism, well, something wrong with the world, you know. And that's, again, unconscious. I think you'd have a hard time explaining this to people in the international legal field or international affairs. They don't understand it. And it's just taken for granted. It's never discussed. Take a look at the literature. See, you can find anybody discussing it except, way out at the margins. In fact, I did, but it was interesting to see the reaction. In one book I wrote, I mentioned that I was reporting some speech of Tony Blair's about how the Kosovo invasion was done in order to save the world from terror. So I said, well, kind of interesting to see what the world has to say about this. And then I quoted the recent summit of the non-aligned countries, in which they bitterly condemned the invasion and the so-called right of humanitarian intervention. The book can't be reviewed in the United States, but it was reviewed in England in the Times Higher Education Supplement by a historian from Cambridge University. And he practically had a tantrum. He said, how can you even refer to these people? What are they? And it's so deep, it can't be seen.
It's unconscious.
It's totally unconscious. It's like you're the professor you thought. And you can go on and on like this. I mean, these are things. The new norm that this war is about is important. It's not preemptive. I mean, preemptive war falls under Article 51 by reasonable interpretation. It has a meaning. Preemptive war means if planes are flying across the Atlantic to bomb the United States, you're allowed to shoot them down before they get here. That's preemptive war. Or you're maybe even allowed to bomb the country they're coming from before they get here. That's preemption. This isn't preemption. This is something new. This is preventive war. That's not preemption. Preventive means we decide that somebody might someday be a challenge to us, and therefore we attack them. That's a new norm that's going to be established because we did it. That gives the United States the right to attack anybody it wants, imagined, invented, or whatever, who might be a challenge. Furthermore, that was declared in September when the National Strategy Report came out. They declared that U.S. policy will be to rule the world by force and to prevent any potential challenge to our domination. And Iraq is an illustration. So if you go to law school, you'll find this establishes a new norm in international relations because the U.S. did it and Britain supported it. So that's a new norm. And I think that's probably a large part of what the war's about, to establish those new norms. Now, why isn't that discussed? This is not preemptive war, it's preventive war, which is something totally different. Now, if commentary was even minimally serious, they'd also point out that there's nothing particularly new about this. I mean, 40 years ago, Dean Acheson, senior advisor to the elder statesman, highly respected, a senior advisor to the Kennedy administration. In 1963, he gave a talk to the American Society of International Law, where he was justifying the U.S. campaign against Cuba, which was extensive international terrorism and economic warfare. He said this is justified, and then he explained why. Well, it didn't have to be anything new, but he said it. That's a, what he said is that in the case of a a U.S. response to a challenge to our prestige, position, and authority, words like that.
Right.
There is no legal issue. That's no different from Bush, and that's the Harvard intellectuals.
It's no different from Mongo.
It's no different from Genghis Khan,
Right,
for
yeah,
that matter.
Genghis Khan,
Yeah.
right.
So it's not. You can say it's not new. Yeah, it's true, but it's a very clear and explicit statement that we are unique. We have the guns, and therefore, if there's a challenge to our position and prestige, no legal issue arises if we respond by international terrorism and economic warfare. The Bush administration is just pushing that beyond, taking another step in that, more brazen, and furthermore giving it an illustration to establish the norm.
Right.
These ought to be on the front pages if you had a free press, and they ought to be in every journal if you had independent intellectuals. There's nothing controversial about this. This is all straight out, perfectly well documented. In fact, if you go to professors of international law, they'll know it. It's part of the international. It just doesn't matter. We do these things. That's the way it is.
So I want to ask you, I'm doing some research on the correlations between Nazi propaganda model and American propaganda model. And have you found any correlations between just the popular culture?
It goes the other way. Take a look at the history.
Really?
The Nazi propaganda model was modeled on Anglo-American propaganda, consciously. So if you read Mein Kampf, Hitler points out that he says with some plausibility that the Anglo-American countries won the First World War because they had better propaganda systems.
Right.
And he says next time we're going to be there. If you read histories of propaganda, this is what takes Randall Marlin has a recent history of propaganda. And he points out what in fact is true, that the first modern propaganda agency was Britain's Ministry of Information.
Right.
Nice Orwellian
Right,
title.
yeah, right.
Whose purpose, they said, was to direct the thought of most of the world, and particularly the thought of American intellectuals, because they had to direct the thought of American intellectuals to brainwash the country into supporting the war, which they did and took great pride in. And it was very successful. The Wilson administration set up the second major propaganda agency. It's called Committee on Public Information, which was also designed to drive a basically pacifist population of the war.
Right.
And it succeeded. And furthermore, its successes were extremely important. Out of the Creel Commission, it was called, came some of the leading intellectuals, public intellectuals, and some of the leaders of the PR industry. Walter Lippmann was one. Edward Bernays, one of the gurus of the PR industry, was another. And both of them in the 1920s appealed directly, explicitly, to the success of these propaganda agencies as a model for how you ought to control people. Mm-hmm. So that's where the concepts of manufacturing consent come from, or engineering consent, by propaganda. And it's kind of and the Nazis emulated it.
Right.
The Bolsheviks tried to emulate it and do a very good job. And if you read, say, Marlin, he just points out, he says, well, these were the models used by the Nazis, the Soviet Union, South Africa, and the Pentagon. It's not really the Pentagon, it's the whole apparatus.
Right.
But that's correct. So there is a connection that goes the other way.
Right.
And it's not obscure.
Right.
If you read in fact, one of the founders of modern political science, Harold Lasswell, he had an important article called Propaganda. Until the Second World War, that was a usable term. Since then, you can't use it. It's got connotations of the Nazis. But in the 20s and 30s, people used it freely. He had an article on propaganda in the Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences, the international encyclopedia. And in it, he describes the need for propaganda in a democratic society, because his words are something like this: we should not succumb to democratic dogmatisms about people being the best judges of their own interests. They're not. They're stupid and irresponsible. We're the best judges of their interests. And since we can't do it by force anymore, because they've won too many victories, we'll do it by propaganda. That's the founder of the modern science of communications that you study.
Right.
And a liberal, progressive, Wilsonian liberal. Wilson, like Bernays. So that's, and in fact, the PR industry just blossomed after that, devoted to exactly that, as do the media and so on. It's pretty straightforward. And yeah, the Nazis did try to emulate it and were pretty good at it. And in fact, there's lots of other similarities. And a lot of people have been, like I have too, I've been going back recently to reading memoirs of the 1930s. And it's pretty striking, the similarities. But there's a deeper part, it goes back. And there's a good reason why the Anglo-American democracies should have pioneered propaganda. I mean, propaganda is pretty closely related to freedom.
Right.
I mean, if a country can control, if a state can control its population by force, it doesn't need much of a propaganda system. It's like, take, say, Franco Spain. I mean, they let people have Marxist study groups, publish anything you want. And as long as they're walking by the torture chamber in the center of Madrid every day and hearing people scream, think what you like. That's one of the reasons I think why Soviet propaganda was so incompetent.
Yeah.
They didn't really need it. They just beat people over the head. But in countries where you can't control people by force, then you need propaganda.
Right.
Because, and it's been understood, and so there's a real correlation. And in fact, these systems develop and are mostly used in the democracies. I mean, others try, but it doesn't work very well, and they don't really care that much. So you go back to the Soviet Union. There were some studies, and maybe one was at UMass. Several Russian research centers in the 1970s tried to do studies of where Russians are getting their information. And they studied emigres and others, and then they came out with some interesting conclusions. It turned out that about 3/4 of the population was getting their information from foreign broadcasts, and of more educated people, like 95%. Among more educated sectors, about half were reading samizdat, illegal underground newspapers, and among working class, maybe 1/6 or something. Now, compare it with the United States. Does anybody ever get a word from from BBC? Essentially nothing. And even, or you hear what anybody says in the third world. It's inconceivable. What are samizdat? Well, samizdat are things like Z Magazine.
Yeah.
If you can sell 25,000 copies, you're delighted. Not the 50% of the population. So in many respects, Russians were getting better access to information than Americans.
Right.
And part of the reason was that nobody believed what you read in Prophet. It was so ridiculous.
Right.
But the Western systems are much more sophisticated, and people tend to trust them. It's where they have people like Powell to make it look as if there's debate and dissent.
Right.
And people do trust them, and they're far more effective. And it's far more necessary. I mean, the Russians could have developed an effective system, but it just wasn't that important, because they could control people by force.
Your analysis seems to be pretty powerful, influenced by Orwell.
Yeah.
Rewriting of history. In fact, some of your subtitles are called, the slogan of the party, which was "War is Peace, Freedom is Slavery, Games is Surrender." But it seemed, in an interview you had, you said, "I've always been resistant consciously to allowing literature to influence my beliefs and attitudes of society and history."
So, for example, I didn't think 1984 was a very good book, and didn't influence me at all.
No.
That's kind of some nice words like Newspeak and so on, but it was a badly written book and not very impressive. His best book, I always thought, was Amish Catalonia, which was his description of real things that were happening. I can't really say that, that influenced me, I would say, but not the famous books. I mean, I read Animal Farm as a teenager and that sort of thing. But on the other hand, he had some very interesting things to say about this topic. So I think maybe the most interesting is the introduction to Animal Farm, which was not published. It was found in his unpublished papers about 30 years later. It's technically published, but very few people know about it. What was the introduction to Animal Farm? Well, it was Animal Farm is this satire about this totalitarian society, Russia. The introduction said it was about England. It said England is a very free society, but outcomes in England are not very different from Russia. And he went on to give some examples. I don't think it's a very good essay, frankly, but it's interesting what he said. What he said is He said in England, of course, it's voluntary. It's voluntary self-censorship. You're not getting any force from the government like in Russia. But he says the outcomes are often similar, and then he gives 2 sentences only to explain why. And the 2 sentences are pertinent. I mean, not enough, but
Right.
they're pertinent. One of them is, he says, the press is owned by wealthy men who have every reason not to want certain ideas to be expressed. And the other is a good education. Yeah, be with me. A good education, he says, I mean, he's thinking of Oxford and Cambridge,
Right.
instills in you the understanding that there are certain things it just wouldn't do to say.
Right.
You're socialized through education, and that leads